Well, good morning and welcome to this special edition of The Agenda. Nice question time, as Private Eye calls us. I consider that a badge of honour, but there you are. Please welcome to the stage this morning, Caroline Nokes, Tory MP for Romsey, my local MP, but no pressure, who is the All-Parliamentary Group Vice Chair on a Fit and Healthy Childhood and the Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Body Image. Onwurah, MP, Labour MP for Newcastle upon Tyne Central, has had a quite meteoric career so far. Shadow Cabinet Office Minister, now Shadow Culture and Digital Economy Minister. Really trips off the tongue, but an important post, formerly an engineer. And Hannah Bardell, one of the new SNP MPs, there's a few of them, you might have noticed, from Livingston, who used to be a journalist. But that's okay, she's taken a few big steps up the evolutionary ladder. Producer, okay, producer. There's a big difference. Who used to work running Alex Salmond's constituency office, which suggests to me she's got an awful lot of interesting stories, which we may not get to this morning. Now, our first discussion is how responsible is the advertising industry? Since the payment of my mortgage entirely depends on all of you, I can answer that quickly. Very responsible. Please keep spending your money, preferably on ITV. Let's have this introductory video. Well, there we are. Let's kick off with the basic question. Caroline, let's start with you. How responsible is the advertising industry?
You know, if I can flick that to how it finished, are any changes needed? And I'm going to speak about my perspective as the chair of the APPG on body image. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes I loathe the way women are represented in advertising with a lack of diversity, whether it be ethnicity, body shape, disability. And I would highlight in particular one of my real bugbears is the adverts that we're shown simply to shock, provoke the complaints, get the reaction. I think of kind of this time last year when we were looking at, are you bikini body ready? That's the sort of thing that really, really makes my blood boil.
You think that was deliberately designed to shock and cause a reaction?
You know, it causes a reaction. You then get millions more column inches than you would otherwise have got from just running the advert. And if I could change one thing, I'd say, look, let's try and promote a bit more positivity about the representation of women, have it more diverse, and actually try and encourage women to feel good about themselves rather than bad.
Okay. Chi?
Well, I think I'd say probably the advertising industry is you're as responsible as you think we are, we not being politicians, but being the general public. And in terms of reflecting where you think society is at, but to flip that on, as Caroline did, in terms of what changes are needed. Obviously, the advertising industry has a huge amount of power, and I would say it needs to look forward more in terms of how social values are evolving. So I think absolutely agree with Caroline on body image and on women and on the objectification of women. But I'd also say looking forward in terms of the use of the mobile advertising, the bandwidth which is taking up with advertising, and how our lives are, how we are consuming content now and in the future. And we want advertising to be a part of that, but not a part which turns off the viewer or the user or the watcher.
Anna?
Yeah. I mean, to me, advertising is an art form in many respects, and it's also something that pervades all aspects of our life. I mean, I grew up in an age where there were 3 TV channels, and since then, we've seen the advent of, Channel 4, Channel 5, digital. It's completely blown it wide open, and probably you'll find your average 8-year-old is more attuned with what paid advertising is or native advertising is to adults of today. But I think there is a responsibility to educate in line with the development and the how much advertising infiltrates our lives. So whilst I think there are many advertisers who are responsible, I think there are as many who are not. And I think the body image thing is a really interesting one. The Jenny Eclair stuff over the last couple of days that, she's put an advert out there that's, representative of a normal woman's body, or whatever you perceive as normal. not the best word to use, but it's not photoshopped. So are we really saying that we're only willing to have images of women or of people who are conformed to a certain largely male view of what's beautiful or what's acceptable? And we're also in a very heteronormative society, so I would love to see more diversity, not just in terms of race and gender, but also of sexuality. There's been some really groundbreaking adverts, the Guinness advert, the Campbell's advert, where we've got, gay parents, and I think there is a responsibility for advertising to reflect society, and I'm not sure that it does at the moment.
Okay, I think Channel 4 and Channel 5 was where it all started to go wrong, by the way, but anyway, that's a separate discussion. I thought ITV on its own was great. But,
I'm just making the point that ITV was already there. So
the good era. Listen, I think it's interesting. I always think of advertisers want to sell stuff. So I always think of advertisers as essentially trying to capture the public mood, because that's the best way of selling stuff. And the John Lewis advert, an interesting example of an advertiser that, in a sort of subtle way, seemed to be highlighting issues of loneliness and old age.
Although I have to say, I tweeted. I tweeted about that after I saw it because it brought a tear to my eye, to be frank. And I had a journalist who will remain nameless who tweeted me back and said he found it deeply offensive and ageist.
Really?
And it started a real sort of discussion online about it.
Why? Because
it just felt that it was objectifying the elderly in a way that, that as if, I'm not sure, he wasn't very specific about it, but it was obviously his very personal feeling, and he is older, over 50.
But just to bring, and there's various points about how responsible the industry is, that it might be worth talking about London-centric, representation of ethnic minorities and so on. But let's just concentrate on the point Caroline raised for a minute, because it's interesting. The body image stuff, I'm never sure. I sort of assume that when that turns into a furore, that's an advertiser misjudging things, trying to be sort of sassy and out there and in your face and misjudging it. But is your view that it's more deliberate than that, that that's just a way of attention seeking in a rather negative fashion?
Yeah, and I wouldn't just limit it to the body image arguments. I'm very conscious of a range of advertisers or a range of manufacturers who go out of their way to have particularly provocative adverts so they can then refer themselves to the Advertising Standards Association. So I have just complained about myself, sort of territory, so that they will just get the publicity from that, because actually they don't want to spend the money to run the ads all over the place. But I think it is a real problem. I sometimes regard it as the kind of the Trumpification of advertising, is that, look, we'll have a really outrageous ad, everyone will complain about it, and then they'll start discussing it. And, much like dear Mr. Trump just seeks to get headlines in America, I think we do see a bit of that in advertising. People like to court controversy.
Do you think that's a major factor, that advertisers are courting controversy in an attempt to get cheap publicity?
Well, I mean, there's a saying, there's no such thing as bad publicity, so I think that's certainly a factor for some advertisers in terms of, the more views, the more the name will be remembered, regardless of whether it's a positive or negative. But I also think, in terms of judging the public mood, we also have to be aware of who's in the room to judge the public mood, and whether the advertising industry itself reflects the public in terms of ethnicity, of gender, of regional diversity, and also of education. So I think it's about, you can't be totally objective in what you're doing. And I think it's really important that we look to, that the industry looks to reflect the changing demographic makeup, as well as looking forward. And it's not saying it's easy, as well as looking forward to see how things are going to be changing in the future. Because I think there was a long period when advertising seemed to reflect a view of Britain which was stuck somewhere in the 1950s and 60s, the traditional, if you like, family, etc. And it took some time to catch up.
Okay, I just want to read out this question from the floor, which is quite pertinent. If there is a responsibility for advertising to reflect society, should responsible advertising show more obese people? There's an interesting specific, Hannah, maybe you could pick that up. There's an interesting specific question in there, but also a general one, whether really it is advertisers' job to reflect society or merely to sell stuff.
Yeah, I suppose it's a vicious cycle, but a lot of the, let's be frank, the products that are being advertised when we talk about the sugar tax and things result in people becoming obese. So it depends on which the context in which you are showing obese people, or people who are overweight. The reality is that as a society, our shape is changing. But is there, you could turn that on its head and say, well, is there not a responsibility to tackle that sensitively in terms of this is what is actually in our product, these are the effects it could have. Now, that's probably not something that's ever going to happen, but we've created an ideal of, whether it's the Coca-Cola ideal or certain sweets or certain images, that you can still have a certain body and a certain lifestyle and eat and drink these products day and daily. I think there's, we do have to reflect society. I think we probably should show people of all shapes and sizes, and not always, the rates of, eating disorders that have gone up, the challenges. I think bringing up a little girl, particularly in today's society, with the kind of images, videos, pop videos, and advertising that is in their face constantly, is incredibly difficult, because it was very different when I was growing up.
Caroline, just to bring back once more to the subject you raised at the start, I was reading in the research in the research brief for this that in 10 years' time, I think, women will control 60% of the national wealth, which was interesting, and that they control 80% of purchasing decisions, which is also interesting. Is it not, isn't the point here that if advertisers, certainly when it comes to women, aren't addressing them absolutely on their own psychological wavelength, then they're missing a colossal opportunity?
I think they are missing a huge opportunity. And to go back slightly to that question, I get quite twitchy about the use of the word obese, because actually all I've ever done is campaign to have a wider range of sizes and shapes used in advertising. I think there have been some great steps forward. Women's Running has started using plus size ladies who are runners on their cover, just to prove that you can be larger than perhaps ideal, but still able to be fit and healthy and to go running. And I think we really want to promote more ordinary shapes and sizes, as we said, more diversity, different ethnicities, different genders, not just the heterosexual norm, which I think pervades an awful lot of advertising still. And I thought it was interesting, the standard of the 1950s. One of my favourite adverts of all times has to be the Oxo family. Linda Bellingham, who sort of, I think, showed us a family that was quite real in terms of the arguments that they used to have. But actually, does that reflect society today?
Arguments at Sunday lunch, surely not.
Can I just on that point, so for example, pink is a fantastic colour. I love the colour pink, but when it is the sole colour used to market to women, it reflects society, because pink does exist in society, but when it's the sole colour used to market to women, and particularly girls, and then it's identified with cooking or with dolls, and then that becomes the careers that girls are being told to aspire to, then it does have very profound implications, and also it changes society as well as reflecting part of society.
I want to move on to our next topic in just a moment, but one other thing, can I just pick you up, G, on, do you think there are other areas you could say the advertising industry is not reflecting society as well as it could? It's very London-centric, certainly in terms of ethnic minorities, people would say maybe it doesn't represent. Do you see some improvement?
I certainly see a huge amount of improvement. I've sort of followed quite closely the reflection, particularly of BME, and being from Newcastle, northern voices and storylines, if you like, in advertising. And I think in the 80s, there weren't any black people in this country, apparently, apart from singing songs, funnily enough. So there's been significant progress there. Whether
many Scots either.
There weren't many. yes, and everybody.
Well, that's definitely changed.
So there has been progress, but there's still a lot way to go. And I think the reason why we perhaps come back to gender quite often is in terms of that, it does seem to have gone backwards in terms of objectification sexually, and the range of the way in which the marketing happens.
Okay, brilliant. That leads us neatly on to talking about regulation. Let's just take a look at this video to remind us of some of the issues. Well, you saw the question at the end there, and actually there's a question from the floor which I just wanted to read out because actually it's quite a useful way. Hannah, maybe you could pick this out. How does the panel think the advertising sector should self-regulate itself around the high-fat, salt, sugar issue? Can we avoid watershed remedies by running more educational campaigns? Self-regulation against regulation. On an issue like that, for example, does the industry need to self-regulate more to avoid regulation?
It's a tough question, but I certainly have some questions around self-regulation. I'm not sure that we are doing, or the industry is doing, as well as it should. And I think there is definitely scope to look at a different form of regulation. In the same way with the press being self-regulating, is that I'm not sure it's been the most successful model. Take phone tapping, for example. However, on that particular issue, we've certainly been very supportive of the watershed, and I personally feel strongly about the watershed, particularly in terms of children. I think there was a report done recently into the objectification and the sexualisation of children, and that is something that I would say, I'm not a mother myself, but I have a niece and I have many friends with young children. It's something that I think is very concerning, and I don't see how education will get us around that. That children are completely consumed by television, by online content as well, and so at what point do you draw a line? And I think maintaining the watershed is important, but I also think in terms of online content, that's very challenging, for parents and for advertisers.
To focus on it and sort of cut to the quick, and things like e-cigarettes, perhaps, but also maybe on sugar. Do we need more regulation? Does Parliament need to lay down the law more?
I worked for a regulator, Ofcom, for 6 years, mainly on technology, but also some responsibilities around advertising. And I think, the British model of self-regulation is quite hard to explain to other countries, in that it seems like a kind of a cozy cartel, if you like. But I think self-regulation can work, where there is a really strong regulator, quite clearly ready to step in, where the market isn't going to drive the right behaviours in self-regulation. And I think when it comes to e-cigarettes, but certainly when it comes to sugar, the market isn't going to drive it, because it is not in the interests of the it's not in the interests of the large sugary product producers to make a step change of the type that we need. So I think it is complicated. You need to look at the market drivers, and you need to always have a strong regulator while supporting self-regulation. But I think on this particular issue, we do need legislation.
Just on the issue of the sugar tax, or sugar generally, would you, if you wanted to do more, would you favour something like a tax, or do you think you need to get more involved in the advertising industry as well?
I don't actually know whether you need to make a choice between the two. When you talk about being involved, you talk about encouraging
regulation,
or
getting involved in the market,
all the different ways in which an active regulator can support certain outcomes. I think legislation tends to be very broad and coarse, if you like, and can drive certain outcomes. So I wouldn't say it's one or the other. I think we probably need to do both and work together to produce sort of the right legislation which shores up the right kind of behaviours and self-regulation.
Karen, regulation, more regulation or not?
Just not a huge fan of regulation. I think that the advertising industry can in itself be incredibly creative, clever, imaginative. We can all think of the adverts that we've either grown up with or that are current now that have really triggered either humour or made us think about the way that we behave. And I do think that there is a role to play for advertising to kind of try and address our behaviours a bit better. But I look at educational campaigns run by governments. I put them in the plural very carefully then. And I just think that sometimes they are really clunky. And
no, really?
Yeah, Yeah. And I think that's a real problem, that maybe we're not harnessing the creativity of an industry that's actually, advertising in our country leads the world, and yet we're not managing to use that as a force for good and trying to change behaviours for the better. But, am I going to start screaming regulation? I think it's really hard. Hannah mentioned it, online content. Now, if you look at the adverts that are driven to my telephone, whenever I go on the internet, it's all about Barchester Care Homes, Saga Holidays, and Tenor Lady. So they clearly have absolutely identified
I
the
get
market.
the same.
Do you really?
No, I don't.
But, if they're managing to pigeonhole me like that, then presumably they're targeting my daughter with stuff that really would appeal to a 17-year-old. And do I feel entirely comfortable about that? No. How on earth do you start regulating that, though?
You mentioned adverts that have particularly, struck you. Speaking on the positive, what and why? Or would you not draw attention to particulars?
Okay, so they're probably in the room right now, and I'm about to offend someone. But I really didn't like the John Lewis advert.
Right.
I don't know why, that just made me feel uncomfortable, made me more uncomfortable when my teenager returned home from college and told me that 2 hours of her communication studies had been discussing one advert. The flip side of that is that I thought the Sainsbury's advert at Christmas with Mog was absolutely, we'd all loved that. We'd loved reading it to our kids, and I just thought, that really packed me off to Hedge End Sainsbury's, you'll be familiar with that, to do my Christmas shopping.
Not
so,
nice
some
place.
works.
Yeah. So, Hannah, let's come back to you. We'll move on to the end in a minute. What, in the end, then, you think that we're moving into a world where some further regulation may be required?
I think I would have to say I agree with Chi on this, that the two have to come hand in hand. And I don't think we can draw a line and say we cannot have regulation. I think it has to go in step with, how as consumers we are approached, and rightly as Caroline says, the nature of targeted advertising, the way our data is used, is also something that we have to consider along with that as well. And obviously we've got the investigatory powers bill going through Parliament at the moment, not necessarily about advertising, but just in general terms, how much of our lives are sort of interfered in, and how targeted we are by adverts. So I think education balanced with responsible regulation is probably going to have to be the way that we go forward.
Okay, we're going to end with, if you had a campaign, if you ran a campaign, what would it be? Let's just take a look at this video. Caroline, if you could run a campaign, what would it be?
Can I firstly say I'm loving the fact that was captioned Conservative. That made me feel really comfortable. If I could, one campaign, and I think I'll probably highlight something that already exists. I think we have to make particularly young women feel better about themselves. So I think that This Girl Can campaign is a fantastic campaign that I would just love to see run. But I think the great thing about British advertising is it does use humour. And in many ways, some of the best adverts aren't even adverts at all. They're the parodies of adverts, and they're one of the finest ways of getting messages across.
This Girl Can is a fantastic campaign. You think would you take it any further? You think it's working? I mean, it's interesting. It's arresting. It gets across this message very well.
I think in this country, probably globally actually, we have a real barrier to keeping young women active and participating in sport and fitness. And it's largely because it's sort of between 14 and 16, they don't see it as cool to get hot and sweaty anymore. They want to look like your advertising stereotype of some perfect, made up, shiny young lady. And I think actually we have to show women playing sport and enjoying it, not necessarily competitively, just for the sake of being active. And I think, we should do a hell of a lot more with that.
Do you think a campaign like that, do you feel that it is changing things gradually? I mean, on that specific issue, because, I've had a teenage daughter as well, it is interesting, and this idea that they feel under pressure to conform to what they think of as the norm for a teenager. But do you think that is changing slowly?
I think the honest answer to that is no, I don't think it's changing. I think the Olympics in 2012 helped, but we're 4 years on from that, and the participation levels are still woeful. And go into any college and compare the hours of sport played there with what they would be at school. It's tiny, and I think it's a barrier we have to break down, and we have to make it easier for all young people, boys and girls, to carry on sport through their teenage years and into clubs and break down the sort of the cultural barrier. The hardest step is the first one, and in many cases that's the one through the door.
Chi, if you could run a campaign, what would it be?
I find this question really, really difficult. I mean, the power that advertising represents, and for both in the private sector and the public sector. I mean, I know we talked about government campaigns being clunky, but I still remember some campaigns from my childhood, my youth, clunk, click, every trip, the green, clunky. Literally clunky, but effective with it, So there are so many campaigns that I would like to run, but I suppose if I can have two, it's my background's in engineering, girls in engineering, but more generally science and engineering as being part of our culture and the creativity that comes with science and engineering, the creativity that you represent in your industry, but isn't seen as a part of technical, digital, scientific careers, and yet is part of what we need, the skills gap we need so much in this country if we're to rebalance our economy, which today's figures show we're still not succeeding in. But more generally, the other campaign would be about community, and helping people, making people see the resources and the assets which are in their local communities. Devolution of power, fragmentation of public services mean that communities are more important than ever to people, and yet because of those very factors, they are also weaker and less engaged with. So to if you like, make people look around them at their neighbours and see the value and the assets there, that would be a fantastic campaign.
Okay, 2 very interesting campaigns. Hannah?
I'm going to go for 2 as well, so I was thinking about this. I would love to take one of the more traditional adverts, maybe the OXO advert, and transform it into what we perceive as a modern society. So different families, different races, different genders, different sexualities, gay couples, and really blow that open and see, what are families around the dinner table today? What do they look like? And how different are they to what was perceived back then as the normal family? And I think the other one, just in as we discuss, advertising, maybe one about advertising, one about how do you consume? How does advertising affect your life to make people kind of take a step back and say, do you see a product in the morning and then go out and buy it in the afternoon? Do you go on holiday to a particular place because, an advert popped up, and make people stop and think about, how much am I influenced by, the adverts that I see? Just
finally, maybe you could pick this up. Political advertising, do you think it's good by and large? When you see political adverts in this country, do you think, whoa, that's nailing it?
It's good fun. It's good fun.
I would be hard put to name a political advert from any party which I thought effectively nailed it. And
surely the Greens singing was the one. Sorry, are there any Greens in the room?
That certainly had humour. I'm not sure all of it was intentional.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I don't think America holds up a model for us to follow when it comes to political advertising. But I'd be really interested to try and understand why it is that I think politics doesn't succeed in advertising the way in which sometimes very complex messages can succeed very effectively.
Do you think that sometimes, Caroline, maybe because politicians don't see themselves the way others do them in quite as clear-eyed enough way?
I think possibly. I think the best advert that you showed up there was the Plaid one, but I would be hard pushed not just not to name one that I thought was good, but I'd be hard pushed to sit through one.
Okay, on that elevating note, so political advertising is the way of the future. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Thank you to my panel. Nice question time. We'll be back on the air on ITV on the 22nd of February. Please watch and tell all your friends. See you then. Thank you.
Sure.